We want to talk now about diplomacy under Presidents Taft and Wilson from approximately 1909 till more or less 1914. That is the beginning of World War I. We'll take World War I as a distinct issue here. President Taft, who was part of the old guard of the Republican Party and part of that business wing of the Republican Party. The Republican Party was always a party of business, but the business interests were particularly strong in the Republican Party in the early 1900s, and Taft was a member of that group that promoted the interests of business, in particular larger businesses. And that meant that he would be promoting the interests of people who thought in terms of dealing with the world on the basis of money. And in fact, we can talk about Taft's diplomacy as being dollar diplomacy. He even talked about it as being dollar diplomacy. This was as opposed to military intervention, which was more common. So this was actually a softer version, a commercial exchange rather than an exchange of bullets in order to get what the Americans wanted, or at least to negotiate with other countries as to what was the best for America, which under Taft and his wing of the party believed very sincerely that they could accomplish more good through business models and by doing business. We still talk that way today in the United States. So dollar diplomacy did not end with Taft, but it really kind of began with Taft. And to Taft, diplomacy was to support, and his vision of diplomacy supported economic partnerships, usually with stronger European partners in developing their colonies and developing underdeveloped areas of the world. He believed in stability and supported stability because businesses do better under stable governance than under unstable governments. Now, that meant that he did not really care what form of government those governments he supported took. What he wanted was that they were pro-business and pro-American business, and that he would intervene with the power of the United States, which generally for him meant the diplomatic power, but sometimes meant the political power of the United States in the interests of U.S. businesses abroad. Now, let's look at one of these things as an example. One of the most important examples, again, of dollar diplomacy was one that failed. And this shows both the attempts and the weakness of dollar diplomacy, the so-called Manchurian Railroad scheme. Taft had tried to interject at the very last minute U.S. business interest and U.S. monetary support for a Japanese-Russian railroad built with Chinese help and financed by England, Germany, and France and Japan and Russia, but not China. He had tried to interject the U.S. business interests and U.S. financing of that railroad up to and including breaking the old deal, getting the partners to break the old deal to allow the U.S. to come in. And this was an attempt both to, quote unquote, partner with the Europeans as well as break their stranglehold on investment in China. This was part of the attack, the open door attack on spheres of influence. He just did it a different way by using private investment money as kind of a cat's paw for U.S. Foreign policy. Well, this failed, and it failed fairly miserably. The U.S. got to invest a little bit of money, but they were always a much more secondary partner than the other investors, and eventually the railroad failed when the Japanese and the Russians could not get along with each other and could not get along with China. So this was a failure of dollar diplomacy. Now, a success of dollar diplomacy, though kind of an ugly success, I guess, is the U.S. intervention in Nicaragua between 1911 and 1913. The U.S. had bankers' interests at heart here, as well as the interests of the United Fruit Company, that is, bananas, which had become a huge and lucrative commodity throughout the world by 1911. So the U.S., at the behest of bankers who had made loans and at the behest of the United Fruit Company, supported a rebellion in Nicaragua, the antithesis of stability, supported a rebellion in 1911, but then sent in 2,700 Marines to support the dictatorial regime of the Diaz family in quelling a second rebellion. They helped get Diaz into power in supporting a rebellion, and then when democratic forces rebelled against Diaz's high-handedness and ham-handedness, then they supported Diaz and actually intervened by sending in troops. Well, let's look now at Woodrow Wilson's diplomacy, because it offers a contrast to that of Taft, but it also offers a continuation of Taft. Now, Woodrow Wilson is a problematic president. He is both a realist and an idealist. And you see both of these things in his foreign policy. He believed his aims in diplomacy, at least until the U.S. got involved in World War I and even at the end of World War I, was that the United States would be a progressive leader of the world community of nations, and that he demanded that governments that he dealt with be democratic and liberal. And he wanted a harmonious world order based on negotiated settlements rather than war. We'll see all of these things come out in his suggested 14 points for ending World War I. But between this point, where we can talk about his aims as a world leader, which were articulated fairly early, and his 14 points, what we see is the realpolitik of his Latin American policy, which is where he spent most of his effort prior to World War I. In the Caribbean, he continued Taft's dollar diplomacy. And when the Dominican Republic again failed to live up to the debts that it had incurred, he sent in the Marines, and the United States occupied the Dominican Republic between 1915 and 1924. In addition, we occupied Haiti when one of its, the way Haiti changed governments was to have a rebellion in the northern part of the country about every 6 years. That rebellion would win. It would throw out the old president and the old government, and then declare default on that old government's debts. Then it would start piling up debt by going to exactly the same people that the previous government had borrowed from, borrowing more money and paying off the interest of that money until it was overthrown 6 to 10 years later by another government that would renege on those debts as well. And many of those debts weren't accrued in order to aid the country. They were accrued simply to pay off political debts to one another and to line their own pockets. So this was a pretty corrupt system in Haiti. Well, Haiti again reneged on paying its debts right after a rebellion. So in 1915, the U.S. occupied Haiti, and we were there until 1934. But we see Wilson's realpolitik in the weird reaction to the Mexican Revolution. And this is a long and complex story that we won't get into, but let me just kind of blip across the top of it here, focusing on Wilson. He vacillated in his support of the Mexican Revolution. It had started before he became president. It had been aggravated in large part by U.S. mining interests. They didn't cause the revolution, but American diplomacy had been twisted by our desire to not only protect American investments in the copper industry, which were threatening to be nationalized, but also to expand the power of these copper barons and cattle barons in the north part of the country, which just aggravated the dickens out of the Mexicans. He eventually, after 1915, Wilson began supporting Carranza because Carranza had become the de facto ruler and, in fact, de jure president of of Mexico. But between 1910 and about 1914, there had been a succession of generalissimos who had declared themselves president of Mexico and disposed of each other through violent means. Well, Huerta, the last of these guys, lost out to Carranza. Carranza, the leader of the rebellious faction, then became president, and his faction splintered and began rebelling against him. But before that rebellion cranked up, which we'll talk about in just a second, an insult at Tampico, the arrest of some American sailors who had gone into a restricted area in the city of Tampico. They had been arrested. They were subsequently released very quickly, and the American demand was not only for their release, but for an apology, which the Mexicans gave very readily. But they also wanted the Mexican governor to be recalled and for the Mexicans to fly an American flag above the Mexican flag and to fire a 21-gun salute at the ships, American ships in the harbor of Veracruz. Well, this was just a little too much to bear, and when the Mexicans refused, the Americans used that as a pretext to occupy Veracruz. Now, one of the issues here really was that Germans were attempting to bring arms into Mexico via Veracruz. And so this Tampico incident that led to the Battle of Veracruz and the occupation of Veracruz for 6 months in 1914 was really a pretext just to seize the port that the Germans were trying to deliver arms to keep these arms out of Mexico. Okay, so in realpolitik, you do what you have to do for very much national interest, and that's what Wilson did. His support of Carranza was less realpolitik and more idealistic, you might say, because Carranza wasn't the brutal butcher that Huerta was. Then Carranza's faction split, and a much more leftist group under the guy in the picture in the center here, Pancho Villa, who was Americans always call him a bandito. He was a general of revolutionary troops. He revolted against primarily the guy on the left of this picture, Obregon, who had been his direct commander, but was trying to enforce some things that Villa, it's really complicated, that Villa completely disagreed with. So Villa revolted against Obregon and against Carranza, for whom Obregon worked. And to get the United States involved in this, his group of guerrilla fighters invaded the United States in New Mexico and killed a number of U.S. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little lost here. Killed a number of U.S. citizens, then retreated back into Mexico. Eventually, this would provoke what's called the punitive expedition, led by General Blackjack Pershing, who you see in this picture on the right, right next to Pancho Villa, who led troops on a year-long chase of Villa in northern Mexico. This was the only action seen by American troops between the Philippine insurrection and World War I, and it wasn't a particularly mass deployment. This was the National Guard troops being mobilized and sent into northern Mexico. One of the most interesting things here is that this was the first time that the U.S. military had used airplanes in military actions, and they were used as spotters to help find Villa. Well, Villa was never actually cornered, though the American intervention and Obregon's troops chasing Villa pretty much got him down to nothing, and he became a cipher after that. He was ultimately retired, and he was assassinated in 1923. So Taft's foreign policy was dollar diplomacy. Wilson's foreign policy was both realistic and idealistic. And we see some of this in both of these presidents' foreign policy activities between 1909 and 1915. So again, thank you very much for your attention.